everybody, welcome back. Sorry about the technical difficulties. We had a little bit of a challenge with our OBS, but we're back and we're excited to hear our guests. So I hope everybody got to see the video. I hope you enjoyed the talented crown dancers. Like I said, that they are really well received in Six Nations and they are famous within the Indigenous communities. So yeah, let's introduce our guest for this evening, Hannah.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear us now. So once again, I will introduce our guests here. So we have Liliana, who is the co-founder of the Amazon Conservation Team. We have David, who is a professor of medicine at the University of Toronto and the past chair of the Canada's Fundamental Science Review from 2016 to 2017. And Nidhi is a research fellow at the United Nations University Institute on Comparative Regional Integration Studies, Belgium, and an adjunct professor at McMaster University. So before we jump into our discussion for this show, we're going to give each of the guests a chance to just briefly introduce themselves and the work that they do. And then once we come back, we will moderate a discussion. We'll work through all the guests and make sure that we are able to hear all the valuable insights from all of our wonderful guests here. So we will start with Liliana. I think, Catherine, you can just go ahead and share her screen or your screen. Unless you need me to. Here, I'll share it. I can share it.
You know, hi, everybody. It's so nice to be with all of you and with you, David and Nidhi and the McMaster folks. It's a great opportunity to share knowledge from different perspectives. So I'll try to go really quick because of the technical difficulties. I'm just going to skim through some of these images. But essentially, ACT was created in 1996. It's our 25th anniversary this year, and so we're going to be celebrating, you know, the painful moments that we've experienced, as well as a lot of the accomplishments that make us who we are. And ACT was created as you know, just to fill a void that existed at the time in terms of working with Indigenous people in conservation. We saw it as an opportunity, and we took our advice principally and originally from Mark, who's the president of the organization, and his mentor, Richard Evans Schultes, who insisted that, yes, we were losing the forest and we're losing them really fast, but the knowledge of Indigenous people was being lost even faster. So we really encourage his students to focus on that. And I shared this photograph with of the Xingu in Brazil. And this was a wonderful opportunity that we had to share with many groups from Colombia, Suriname, Brazil, Canada, and the United States, of course. There you see Arvel and you see Dawn. And basically, I think that this circle and this conversation just shows you what ACT does a lot of, which is bring people together. And I'm just going to go really fast, but I wanted to show this and go into some detail. But essentially, this is an illustration of how ACT goes about dealing with Indigenous knowledge and livelihoods and developing the programs. I'm going to give you guys that information. You can keep it. And if you have questions, let me know. But essentially, you see how everything is really circular and everything is totally connected. Next. Our work has been expanding a lot, but we don't go to wherever sort of the philanthropic light is shining. Rather, we know that working in conservation really requires a focus and having it being integrated and holistic. And so our main areas of work are Colombia and the Guianas, principally Suriname and Colombia, and Brazil. And, you know, for instance, 1996, where we started with like 6 groups, now we're up to 62, doing a ton of different work. I don't have time to go into that kind of detail right now, but suffice it to say that the only way that we work with communities is if we have an invitation because they have heard through word of mouth about our work, and not because we kind of come in with a lot of money and try to get people to do what we think we're best at. Next. The recording stopped. I don't know if that's an issue.
I think it's fine.
Okay, fine. So there's more images, but we can stop and move forward. I just wanted to bring attention to the importance of territory for us. We have 3 pillars. One of them is livelihood, the other one is governance, and the other one is territory. And that's really critical because, as some of the elders that we work with said, you know, Indigenous people without their lands cease to be Indigenous people. And so they, and traditionally, especially in Latin America, a lot of these very large territories are the headwaters of the major rivers. So you can, you know, understand clearly what that entails for the livelihoods of the people of the Amazon. But just in the last 4 years, you know, we've managed to title over 2 million acres of indigenous lands in various forms. Next. This just gives you more detail about how we've gone about that. That in some cases, just like last year, we were able to do the census as we do here in the United States. Having a census of the indigenous communities equals rights. And so we were able to do that in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, where that is a home to the Kogi, the Arhuacos, the Wiwas, and Cancuamos. And that was really difficult work. And you might wonder, how could an organization that proclaims to do conservation work do census work? Well, nobody else was doing it. And being able to do a census will guarantee those rights and those resources that they desperately need. Next. Again, livelihoods, again, you can provide land and titling, but if they don't have the means in some cases to sustain themselves and to be able to generate some income, and then often they end up leaving. So what we try to do is we work with the knowledge that they already have instead of imposing new ideas that are foreign and difficult to accept many times. Next. And I want to call attention to the isolated peoples programs, or people that live in total isolation. ACT was a pioneer in Colombia in being able to identify and prove the existence of uncontacted peoples. And we don't go, you know, just like, okay, here's a picture, there's indigenous people here. We do from A to Z, identified where they were through digital images, all the way to working with the indigenous communities that surround their territories, so that they would be the ones that would protect their family members. This is very different from what has been done in Brazil, for example, where there's indigenous people that are in isolation and the government comes in and says this is their territory. That's not how we did it. We developed, you know, the protection plans with the guard stations, and all the way to a public policy for the protection of isolated peoples, so that they have the right to that isolation. Also, you know, it's a question of human rights and a question of also protecting some of the most important extensions of forests that are absolutely critical for mitigating climate change. Next. And these are just some images in terms of the research that we do. It's really, we support the research that is defined with and for the community. So it isn't something that they're going to publish, you know, in some academic journal, but rather it's developing the tools that the kids, principally the kids, need to be able to work in monitoring the rivers and the water quality. A lot of the research is just like, it's fascinating for them. And so what we do often is bring in academic institutions that have never set foot in these areas. And so there's a real cross learning. This is why I like the way you guys set this up, you know, that there's, you know, a physician, there's a land rights expert, and there's me, a conservationist, you know, because we need to have these kinds of alliances. So we make it a point to take people that would never set foot, especially in dangerous areas in Colombia, to be able to go and understand what's really needed. So we provide that, the interface between ancestral knowledge and technology. Next. I also want to, just kind of focus a little bit of attention on our response to COVID. Our staff, became frontline responders to, just a tragedy that is happening in the Amazon. And so we have gone from providing protective equipment and meals to sheltering the people that got stuck in the cities that could not go back to the communities because they would contaminate everybody else, to improving the facilities, the healthcare facilities in areas that didn't even have anything. There was, maybe a bed or so. And so we have been really active in providing that response in conjunction, obviously, since we are not medical staff, with medical institutions and medical schools and universities as well. So I invite you to visit our website so that you can see what we've done. I'm actually really proud of this work and everything that it has entailed in terms of the learning, and the adaptation that we have to consider as we go forward. And then this is just like the area where we work. It includes Costa Rica a little bit, but in Costa Rica, it's just a small little project that it revolves around the protection of endangered turtles and the relationship of healthy big cat populations. And so happy to talk more about that, but I'm done. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Liliana.
All right.
Hannah, did you want to ask your question?
Me?
No. Okay, no. Yeah, so Hannah, did you want to?
I will go to David now quickly, just to give his introduction.
Okay.
Oh, wrong one. Can find the right slides here. There we are. That's got it. Now, see if we can get it where it should be. There we are. Is that showing up on the screen?
No.
No. Okay. How about that? Not yet?
No, not yet.
Oh,
Maybe, yeah, you just click share screen at the bottom and then choose your window where
yeah.
your PowerPoint is.
Let me see if I can get that to work. My apologies.
No problem. But thank you so much, Liliana. And I treasure your work in the Amazon. And it's like you are doing wonderful things. And like not just wonderful, but like impactful things. And all of these people on the panel are doing amazing things with their work and their lives, and they will go down as legends. And it's like, it's amazing what you can do and what you're doing. And you probably saved lives in the environment and hundreds and hundreds of acres. And I think that we can come back to you definitely after these few questions, but because we are on a short time. So yeah, I think Hannah will come back to you possibly, and we'll get back to Hannah.
David's slides are up now, so he can give his little spiel here.
Thanks very much, Hannah. And thank you for inviting me to join you. Hello, everyone. I have to start by saying how bowled over I am by Liliana's work and what ACT does. This is a very different ecosystem. It's not a multinational ecosystem. It doesn't involve that kind of remarkable partnership with a variety of Indigenous peoples. It's really referring to work that was done at the behest of the Canadian government that tries to look at the ecosystem of how research is done. And in many ways, part of that work is quite relevant to the theme of the show, which is really about decolonizing science and thinking through the ways that Indigenous knowledge connects with a lot of the other forms of knowledge that are very prevalent in our society. And let me just set a little background. A couple of years before this panel got going, which worked through 2016 and 2017, to examine the Canadian research ecosystem. I had the good fortune to chair another federal panel looking at healthcare. And I will say that was a bit of an eye-opener because although our broad remit was to look at how healthcare could be improved and made more innovative across the country, we also spent some time getting to grips with some of the issues affecting the First Nations and Inuit health branch as it then was. And I will say only that we were pretty unsettled by what we saw in terms of the state of healthcare, the transitions between the different healthcare systems, the lack of co-governance, except in one province, British Columbia. So we actually had a whole page, I think, of recommendations that I'm not sure the government entirely welcomed about upending a lot of what was going on and creating more in the way of co-governance and co-creation of quality council and the management of data and many other things. So that was a bit of a dry run for 2016-17 when we got going on with another panel of remarkable individuals and great participation from the research community, particularly young researchers, to try to figure out how to make our research ecosystem better. And a certain Professor Don Martin Hill was one of those who met with us at a panel session and made a heck of an impression about some of the issues we were facing. Let me see if I can go on here and get the next one. We seem to be moving without, where are we? There we are, so I have to go up this way. Good. One of the things that was really an eye-opener for us was when we came across what was at the time almost a quiescent institute called the Institute for Integrative Science and Health. And it had been set up by a visionary professor, Cheryl Bartlett, at the University of Cape Breton, who viscerally understood the need for the ways of Indigenous knowing to be reconciled and brought together with the mainstream science, if you will, to inform how we thought about health and wellness. And Professor Bartlett actually retired in 2012, although I'm sure she's still active. But this was a really interesting experience for members of the panel as we got our heads around what was going on in this small but dynamic outpost, really, of new ways of thinking. And what was striking was that an elder had played a key role, Elder Albert Marshall, with the Eskasoni First Nation, in bringing forward to the attention of the professor what was referred to as two-eyed seeing. And he's a very modest man, a riveting speaker. I put a YouTube address that he gave that I found particularly compelling on the slide. But Elder Marshall was at pains to disclaim ownership of this way of seeing the world. Thought of it as inherent in how his people saw the world. But the theme was very much about bringing together the best of Indigenous ways of knowing tied to the natural world and the best in Western or mainstream ways of knowing, so that you would get new insights that would not otherwise be available. And what I think resonated for many of us who are familiar with visual gestalts, which we've all played those visual games doing, whether you see the two profiles and the vase or whether you see the rabbit or the duck, it's this sense that you, depending on how you're looking at things, only see one or the other. And as Elder Marshall argued, we need a whole generation of people who can see both at once, who can actually begin to bring these together. You can do it with teams in which you have, elders, knowledge keepers, Indigenous researchers, and of course, allies and colleagues working from other disciplines in a more mainstream paradigm. But what is being missing from the Canadian ecosystem is a generation of younger researchers who really are fluent, if you will, in both paradigms. And this was part of the insight that we certainly got, was a real need to build capacity to bring forward that new generation. And so we devoted a fair bit of text in the report to laying out the case and heard substantially the frustrations of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit scholars and scientists who had struggled to find a foothold in environments that were not always conducive. We heard the frustrations of students who felt that their particular way of seeing the world was not fully embraced and supported, and had a real sense that there was, from a variety of accounts, tremendous potential here. A tradition of gathering information about the natural world, a tradition of oral history that was actually invaluable to provide a different lens than that which would be acquired by the mainstream techniques, which tend to be more atomistic and reductionist, and which are very powerful, obviously, and sometimes very precise. This sense of another perspective struck us as invaluable. And so we did recommend that one of the things that was required was for all three of our national granting councils to overhaul how they approached this whole area of Indigenous knowledge. And what we basically called for was the creation of a major strategic thrust within the three councils. It would be overseen by a new coordinating committee that we also said should be set up to provide a more integrated view across natural science and engineering, across the social sciences and humanities, and into the health sciences broadly understood. And that recommendation, in fact, was accepted by the government and has moved towards, albeit with the usual rather glacial pace of all governments, took a while to get money into place and to get all the machinery into place. But there was published about 1.5 years ago a serious overview, a new strategic plan. It clearly involves substantial consultation with the Indigenous community. One always worries about what consultation means, I can say as an old cynic, but it looked and still looks pretty compelling. You have a pretty faithful acknowledgement of some of the issues that the various council leads heard. You had a commitment to building advisory councils comprised of Indigenous leaders and scholars and scientists. You had a recognition of the challenge that Indigenous students were facing, which I think was extraordinarily important. A commitment to supporting research priorities set by and with Indigenous communities, which was also positive. And I love the language about linking reconciliation, which is, I think, a leitmotif for how more and more people think about the relationship with Indigenous communities, linking that to decolonization of how Indigenous research would unfold. So these were encouraging developments, I think. I do want to close on a kind of both positive and cautionary note. We're in the midst of an extraordinary global epidemic, a pandemic by all measures, that has really shaken up a lot of the way certainly Canadian society sees itself, brought to light a lot of fault lines. And I think there's a huge belief that we should embrace on the other side of the epidemic in Canada, some changes in how society functions and how we conduct our affairs. It will be interesting to see if that happens, because I must tell you, having been closely involved with the SARS outbreak that touched down heavily in Canada, particularly in my hometown of Toronto in 2003, there was a lot of talk about a new normal, and the new normal never came. The old normal returned very quickly. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, because we really had a bit of a year of treading water. What happens with that strategic plan and whether it gets the momentum that I think it deserves and should have. But I would say that, there is clearly life still in that notion of two-eyed seeing. It has, as a concept, almost as a kind of sort of quiet movement, momentum of its own. And I continue to think that if we worked harder at understanding these two epistemologies, these two ways of seeing the world, that there would be substantial new insights gleaned across the social sciences and the sciences and humanities that could be invaluable. So I remain optimistic that on the other side of the epidemic, that strategic plan that we helped kickstart in 2017, 2018 will in fact get underway. And I hope it will be a different era, especially for younger people with Indigenous roots or interest in Indigenous knowledge, so that they can pursue their own studies, their own research, their own lines of inquiry and knowledge generation and translation. And perhaps with two-eyed seeing, bring us new insights and create a better world. So that's all I have to say, but again, honored to be here. A bit of an imposter among people who are on the front lines, but this is a little bit of work about our research ecosystem that I wanted to share with you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, David. We're going to ask questions after. We lost a little bit of time, so we'll go to the next guest and then come back and ask the questions that the students prepared. Thank you for that.
Yeah, Nidhi, did you want to start your presentation?
Thank you, Makasha. And while I'm loading my slides, I would like to take the opportunity to thank our young host today, Makasha, Hannah, Catherine, under the leadership of Professor Don Martin Hill, and my co-panelists, Lilian and David, who are doing massive efforts to take the theory of decolonizing science to action points, and that's immensely pertinent. Decolonization of science. If we have to renew our relationship with nature, decolonization of science and research has a significant role to play. Our narrative that we are discussing today, so that we can mitigate the disproportionate legacy of Western scientific knowledge, thought, and culture that has been mainstreamed in education and research domains. According to many advocates, this is just not about increasing the grants, the funding, or representation of different stakeholders, including indigenous people on the table, but to slowly and gradually dismantle the hegemony of singular value and knowledge systems. And this is a huge, massive challenge that each one of us are undertaking to see that we can achieve that goal. According to many experts and the available literature around the world, there is a need to change curriculum in the academic space, and many universities around the world, agencies and institutions and countries have begun to take action and establish review. This is good news.
Nidhi, we can't see your slides.
Yeah,
I haven't changed yet. So this, this is just a little bit of a preview before I take you into that journey of how we are doing it. Okay. So today I'm representing these two institutions, McMaster University, where Professor Don Martin Hill is taking that initiative to take it from theory to action, and United Nations system. And how we are doing that, I'm going to provide you with some examples as a positive hope that we are on the right track, but we need efforts to go on, and young champions like Makasha, Hannah, and many others around the world to take it to higher levels, to speak about it in the global fora. Let me give you some examples of what UN agencies are doing in the sense, okay, let me first change it. This is more clear, I guess. The United Nations has put an effort to establish a permanent forum for Indigenous people. I think that was a promising intervention to bring voices of Indigenous people from around the world to design, co-create, develop sustainable development agendas and planning. There are several other instruments, global instruments alongside the permanent forum, and most common and most acknowledged now is the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, UNRIP, that was enforced in 2007. The Canadian government adopted it in 2016. In the December of 2020, legislation was put on table. An action plan will follow if that is passed in the parliament. So good news there. There are other mechanisms on acknowledging the right of Indigenous people, MRIP, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Rights of Indigenous People, UNSR. Let me quote something from UNRIP. To enhance harmonious and cooperative relationship between states and Indigenous people based on the principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, non-discriminatory practices, and good faith. But it's not legally binding. So the onus is on member states, on countries and agencies to see that this is plugged appropriately and action is taken effectively to integrate it in national policies. Amid many other articles, the Article 40 of UNRIP is very inclusive. It talks about integrating customs, traditions, rules, and legal systems that come from the indigenous practices into resolutions and policies, and for settling disputes with the state. And it definitely applies to the context of decolonizing science and promotion of indigenous research in the context of larger sustainable development agenda and goals. Many other UN agencies have taken a careful note of UNRIP and have designed their planning and policies to take careful note of several articles, like the Article J of the Convention on Biological Diversity, that takes note of integrating traditional practices of maintaining and preserving and restoring ecosystems, followed by Indigenous people. UN Habitat has taken it in the context of designing urban policies for Indigenous people. UNESCO has taken note of Article 29 of UNRIP for conservation and protection of the environment in its own policies. And many of these interventions by different UN agencies do talk about at least two key dimensions, amid others: self-determination, which is a cardinal principle of the modern international law, but is often in contention with territorial integrity. So this is something we need to still deconstruct and resolve at many levels. FPIC, free, prior, informed consent, have also made its way into United Nations program on reducing emissions and deforestation, and through deforestation and degradation, UN RED guidelines. Especially when we talk about carbon credits, the carbon and climate change discourse, which focuses on participation of Indigenous people into forest-dependent communities, in particular in context of UN RED. These are small examples, and there are many other initiatives and programs that are feeding into the larger discourse of mainstreaming these dimensions into the larger goal of sustainable development agendas and policies. FAO's policy on Indigenous and tribal people outlines many dimensions, as you see on the slide, and I'll not repeat them. You all must be knowing these are very core to acknowledging and integration of Indigenous research and knowledge and value systems into planning and policies. The World Bank has also shown initiative through several programs and in focus attention on funding Indigenous research and acknowledging that Indigenous people are culturally distinct societies and communities. And they make a significant percentage of the global population, though it might be only 5%, but their value systems and the knowledge systems that they bring on the table are having far larger impact in restoration, sustenance, and conservation of ecosystems around the world. Sustainable Development Goals, launched in 2015, is a promising pathway, or offers a promising platform to look into these complexities and maybe take an approach to handle some of them while addressing the larger goals of poverty, hunger, health, education, gender equality, water needs, sustainable development of communities and cities, of energy needs, and many other dimensions that apply to sustenance of lives and livelihoods. What I'm going to just give you a snapshot of is an international global assessment report that was by International Governmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBS in short. Around 150 scientists from around the world gathered together to understand the trends and patterns of our natural systems. And the report that was released in 2019 showed that nature's dangerous decline. We are losing around millions of species through direct and indirect impact of anthropogenic interventions. And these numbers on the screen may seem grim, but there's also hope because we have started to acknowledge that we are losing nature's contribution to our life at an unprecedented rate. So perhaps it's time from different disciplines, from different interventions and innovative thinking by agencies, by different stakeholder groups, and especially in recognizing the value and knowledge from indigenous communities. And let me point out what is in fact said in these summary for policymakers that was a part of the assessment. Though more inclusive governance may be required for integrative science, better integration, as David was pointing out, as Lilian was showing, at different levels across scales, promoting investment in solutions and addressing fragmentation in existing policies. These are low-hanging fruits which we can certainly help to the bigger agenda of decolonizing science and integration of indigenous knowledge and value systems into mainstream sustainable development planning processes and agendas, but also acknowledging that indigenous maintained landscapes around the world are declining at a much lesser rate, though they are under pressure, but they do give us examples and motivation that if we blend our living and livelihoods with nature and acknowledge nature's contribution to our existence, we have a better chance of survival. And to acknowledge all that, UN is now declaring 10 years of working together to see that we have restored something which we have degraded or which we have lost. So on 5th of June, 2021, UN will launch the Ecosystems Restoration Decade to prevent, halt, and reverse the degradation of ecosystems worldwide. And the agenda and the guidelines of this decade specifically acknowledges and integrates that rural communities, especially indigenous people, have long been the custodians of ecosystems, and their rights and building on their knowledge, we can achieve much larger, higher rate of success for restoration and for protecting world's biodiversity. By combining indigenous knowledge with modern technology and latest of scientific research, we have a better chance. Thank you everyone for hearing.
Thank you, Nidhi. I'm just going to jump in here, and I know we got a bit of a rocky start, but I think it's such an important conversation. And the common denominator, I think, in the logic of the three of you is, you know, what Liliana's group has been doing is in line and in sync with what I try to do within the institutions. And you know, when we went to visit the Amazon Conservation Team group in Brazil, we had to essentially not tell the truth on a grant because there was no grant in Canada that allowed Indigenous people from here to go learn from Indigenous people in the Amazon, which is why we were going there. So we had to say we were like coming in as doctors and whatnot to, you know, give them, I don't know what we said, water, knowledge or something. And it just feels wrong. It is wrong that we have to not be able to do our research in a truly Indigenous way and kind of contort, you know, reality to be funded to do what we wanted to do, which would be very much look like the Amazon Conservation Team. So it's really important for community to know, particularly that's who we speak to in our audiences, is, you know, the UN is supporting this initiative. Naylor's review of the Science Council supports Indigenous knowledge. Liliana's been doing it outside almost of academia. And that's kind of where Indigenous knowledge has had to live, unsupported, while scientists get, the budget's pretty massive when you look at the overall funds that are spent. So I think our goal is to find out what steps do we need to take to move forward, and move Indigenous knowledge forward, because it's either at the very high level. So even our Global Water Futures project, flying colors, people are talking about it. It's a global model, all these good things, but on the ground, your universities and the people, the scientists that you work with every day kind of don't get it. So there's a missing link there on that. And how do we resolve those issues so that students like Hannah, and I know she has some questions related to that, and Makasha, don't have to continue the tradition of kind of not telling the truth on what they're really doing, or just staying silent because they don't want to be treated in a certain way by their peers, that this isn't really science, this isn't really valuable work that you're doing, and you're like throwing your career away if you do it. That is the messaging they get. How do we correct that on the ground so that Liliana wouldn't have to be outside of academia? We need that leadership inside of academia to decolonize. What steps do we need to take? And that's for all of you. Anyone who wants to take the challenge.
I have a feeling that as a pointy head, this one is something I have to take up. So I think that the challenge is that you've got to find a way to do some bloodless neurosurgery on the generation of people who are making decisions and holding budgets. And that it happens in random ways. It happens if you turn up at a panel of professors in I think it was in Ottawa, and make an extraordinary case that opens minds. It happens if the hard scientists, as it were, we had two physicists on the panel, Art McDonald and Bob Bergeneau, both Nobel level, Art a Nobel laureate. Fortunately, we had fantastic professor of sociology, Claudia Malacrida, and Ann Wilson, who was a psychologist, and that gave us more balance. But to get hard scientists to kind of get comfortable with this, some of it was just this sense of the two gestalts that seemed to kind of resonate. So just opening minds helps. And I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada has, Senator Sinclair and his team have done amazing things to change the conversation. When I look at the three granting councils, Don, I'd say, to their credit, there's massive amounts more going on now that is attempting to support Indigenous knowledge and the reconciliation of the two paradigms. But what's missing, I think, is still, we haven't brought up that young generation of people who have the two-eyed seeing kind of baked into their brains. And I remain optimistic for one other reason, and that is, Nidhi talked about the focus on restoring ecosystems. More and more people recognize that this global pandemic is a function of ecosystem degradation, right? These are zoonoses. The last one we had was SARS, and MERS was a zoonosis. So as long as we continue to degrade ecosystems and create these bizarre opportunities for mutation and jumping between species, we're going to have more of these, very challenging outbreaks. They're bellwethers for an unhappy planet and for an unsustainable way of doing business. Mm-hmm. So I remain optimistic with that, but I have no illusions that this is solved.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's helpful. I mean, Liliana, just in your experience, because you do, like, it seems like Stanford, Harvard want to work with the work you're doing, but how would education be improved, like for Hannah and Makasha? Like, how would it look? Because I know it's different in Latin America and other places of the world besides Canada.
Yeah, I know. I think that there's a real hunger for access to those two worlds that you talk about, right? And to not hide. And so what we have done is try to take a little bit of every context in which we work. So, for example, in some of these very remote communities, like there are no nurses, so we have to start from scratch in training one person in one community, to be able to become a nurse. And we fund that from A to Z, but that's just one person, right? And then we try to also introduce young people like the ones you met at the permanent forum to, we created a leadership internship so that they stay here at my house, and this is Washington. And so, they're able to work at the Colombian embassy and work at the Human Rights Commission at the OAS and go to the permanent forum and get a better understanding of how these institutions work or not for Indigenous communities. I think that it's really important for these future leaders to understand the systemic problems that exist with these very large institutions that are, with the best of intentions, so damn slow. The deterioration is happening so fast, and we're losing all that knowledge. But I think that the way that these institutions are set up, whether it's academia or the UN or OAS, so slow, right? And they overwhelm and they discourage Indigenous people from really partaking in that system. So our goal has been to introduce them to how these institutions work, how they should work, and that, we got to just kind of shift these dinosaurs around, because there's no time, because we're just, we're getting sick, we're losing forests, we're losing knowledge. And more importantly, from my perspective, is that we are disenchanting young people from wanting to tackle the system. No different than young people not wanting to be part of politics. We really need young people to get involved in certain new ideas. And so, in Suriname and in Colombia, what we've done is we've gotten elite universities to go down to areas of extreme conflict and say, this is what economics looks like. When you try to empower Indigenous people, or you say you do, you need to understand the context. It's not about taking these people out and bringing them to your comfy offices, but you go and suffer and understand what it is that these people are living. So we try to do this, from every perspective. And try to create a systemic change. So, like one of the things that we've done just recently that I'm really proud of is, we partner with the Constitutional Court, because there are courts everywhere, right? And often they will hear cases that benefit Indigenous people, but do they get translated into the local languages? And do the elders and the tribal authorities understand that that court up there has actually, had a decision in their favor, but they don't know anything about that. So we translated those into 26 languages to start with. So I think that empowerment is really critical. Getting young people to understand the constitutions and all of these charters that the UN has and that research institutions have, so that they can demand those rights. They need to be able to go work with the elders so that those rights are enforced and not just on paper.
Mindy?
Maybe, Tom, I can add two points to complement what David and Liliana just said. And I think empowerment remains, of course, critical, and alongside acknowledgement and integration. Take, for instance, a university. You're acknowledged for publishing in a scientific journal, but you're not acknowledged if I conduct a workshop at Six Nations. So these kind of acknowledgement remains critical in not just getting your credits, but also getting a sort of incentives for doing something different. That's point one. Second point in research is that research is heavily dependent on indicators and evidence. And that's how science transforms into a policy, using these vehicles, so to speak. And if these, when we were doing the global assessment report, and this was the very first report where indigenous and local knowledge was given its due, a proper space. We had 60 individuals from around the world, indigenous people or experts on indigenous research, as the part of the discourse to design the global assessment together with experts from biology and ecology and hydrology and other disciplines. So this is not plugging something for decoration of research outputs, but co-creating, and something that you've been doing so well in the Global Water Futures program. So I think once we have those indicators and evidence from these value and knowledge systems acknowledged into high-level reports, spoken about in high-level forums, then that creates a momentum for scaling and also for wider adoption and adoption. So I think these are few things one can put into place through programs and projects. And I think McMaster has taken a lead through the Global Water Futures funding, and several other programs are also funded by UN in different parts of the world.
That's really helpful. I know, Liliana, you have to get going. We were supposed to be 1 hour and we never.
Yeah, I have 10 minutes.
So if you do, then I just want to ask one more question of Lily. What do, because we tried to replicate what ACT was doing, and we had national organizations funding PhDs, doctors, lawyers, all indigenous, and we could not replicate it. And I think, you know, that's interesting that in the Amazon, you're able to produce baseline inventory of your biosphere, training young people in traditional medicine through apprenticeship programs. Like, what is it? What do you see as the barrier to why a bunch of doctors, lawyers, and PhDs that are all indigenous and have access to funding, great amounts, but we're not able to pull that together? And and it's not for not trying in every conceivable way.
Yeah. I think it's such a different context. We work in areas, and you have the privilege of going way out there, and it's very different. You don't have a bunch of doctors and lawyers. It isn't that there aren't indigenous people that are lawyers and doctors, but that is precisely the problem when they get away from their communities and they don't go back. And in many, I mean, I'm being very candid, but we keep away from like professional Indians, because they love to represent the communities, but they show up and it's like, who is this person? They don't understand, what we're doing, the suffering, the lack of water, the lack of food, the health issues, and they're so far removed. And so, one of the things that we have been incredibly deliberate about is creating the capacities within the communities, so that, we don't go around, hiring some of the best talent. That talent needs to work for the communities and not for ACT. And we often get criticized, ACT doesn't have enough indigenous staff on the board, on the indigenous staff. And it's like, it's not that. We are trying to co-create, co-imagine a different, or at least understand the aspirations of these communities, but that is done by them and for them and with them, to not create dependencies, and so that those capacities stay in place, and that they are the authors of their own research rather than being the subjects of more funding for more research that ultimately does not make it back to their communities. And so I think that that is probably, you know, the biggest difference, in that you just don't have the kinds of advancements and possibilities that Indigenous people have here in North America. And what's really tragic, I think, is that, my God, it is really hard to imagine when I tell people that there are some communities in Canada that don't have running water, right? It's like, how could that be? How could it be that water is an issue in such such a rich country, and in the United States? The poverty that I've seen, you know, in South Dakota, when I had the privilege of going out to green grass, you know, that was heartbreaking, and an incredible lesson to the people that visited and from the South and like to idealize the North. So, you know, we try to ground that as much as possible. And that the other thing, you know, not disrespecting anybody, but, you know, we are really, really mindful of who we take money from. We don't take money from any fossil fuel companies or from institutions that have their theory of change and have everything set up, because what ends up happening when we partner with these groups is that they have an outcome that is contingent on another large institution. And so the ways of being and the timing and the ceremonies and the time that it takes to actually get some meaningful work done goes out the window. And, you know, an elder once told us, when we started talking about a management plan, he said, don't come talk to me about a management plan, because what a management plan from your perspective does is it takes authority away from me. It really does, because it is a completely different concept. So when we talk about decolonizing, I'm adamant and obsessed about decolonizing conservation and coming up with different categories of conservation areas. And we've done that very effectively, that really respond to the needs of the people that want them, whether they're sacred sites or for women, for plants of knowledge, whatever it is. So I think that is the reason what ACT has tried to do is to provide some examples of how to work differently, but it's a little like a boutique approach and not like a Walmart approach. It can't be done in a large scale, but it can be done. I think that if you have the people and the willingness to allow for the people that know best and understand their communities best to do their best work without those crazy restrictions and the language that just like turns them off.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great.
I mean, I don't know if I answered your question, but
no, you did. That's exactly it. I mean, that's exactly, you got to all the points that are key. Don't know, there's nothing to add there. You're right on all sense. And trying to do Indigenous knowledge within an institution is almost an oxymoron, right? And that's what we found in our efforts, was it's not going to fit. And all we should be as a partner to facilitate community research and support that research and we get a lot out of it. We still publish, but the primary goal is the community does the research and defines the research for us. Yeah. If they want, some scientific testing, which they always do. I mean, the IK piece was all scientific. It was mercury in our water testing. Like they want, it's not anti-science, but they decided what would be done, when it would be done, and how it would be done. Yeah. And I think that's decolonizing.
Yeah, it's hard, I mean, like for us, it's been really hard work. And at the outset, we had donors that were like, talk about biodiversity, don't talk about Indigenous people. I mean, literally, I won't say names, but it was like, what? This is just so short-sighted. So I think we've come a long ways. I mean, there's a lot of interest now in Indigenous people and a lot of people wanting to get involved and stuff. And I think that that's great, but there's a really long ways to go. And anyways, I'm happy to share whatever you guys want. I mean, we're a pretty weird organization, very different. And so and we like it that way. But you know, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for all the hard work. And I think that these conversations are absolutely vital because it brings in all these different perspectives. And it's only through having these conversations that we're going to be able to meet, you know, and have a mutual ground and be able to deconstruct some of the prevailing systems of thought and allow a cleaner path for the young generations to take over and
Thank you, Lily.
all right, bye everybody. Thank you. I'm so sorry I can't stay.
Yep.
Take
Anna.
care. Bye bye.
Speaking of the younger generation, I know Hannah's been patiently waiting. She's has some student-centered, I think, questions that are really important to also highlight, not just the higher level
Yeah.
epistemologies we like to talk about.
Yeah, and I think that all the points that Lily just made tie into this well. So this next question is going to be for David. So I just want to give a bit of a preamble so that you understand where we're coming from for our audience. In terms of COVID, this podcast that we're doing right now, Indigenous Let's Talk Water, was a direct response to when all of our labs shut down, when we couldn't go into school anymore, and especially, you know, people like me outside of community couldn't go in anymore. We took to this platform to disseminate our research, conduct our research even, which, little plug for next week, that's what we'll be talking about as the second part to this series. So we did things a little differently, and in essence, they were more indigenized without realizing it right away. So I guess my question for David is, you had talked about there were changes and modifications made during COVID that showed that we do really need to change. How do you see those changes coming about, and what do you see them being? I mean, once we're out of COVID, or even however long we're going to stay, like, still be in this place.
Yeah, I think one of the obvious ones is not tied specifically to higher ed, but to the whole issue of determinants of health coming into really sharp focus. You know, the pandemic is hit racialized neighborhoods particularly hard. There've been, initially it was, thank heavens, pretty quiescent, and then started hitting remote Indigenous communities hard. We had severe outbreaks. You know, no particular group's being spared, but obviously if you're in a middle-class neighborhood sitting in an urban area with a salary, your circumstance is completely different than if you're a gig worker or you have to go out and work in some, you know, essential industry where you're turning up and you're in a congregate setting and exposed to the virus. So we know that there's been differential attack rates, and all that sort of has, I think, sharpened a sense of, you know, a more holistic view of what determines health rather than healthcare alone. And obviously, as a physician, I'm, you know, big believer in good healthcare, and access to it. But I think many people have had a real reminder about the broader determinants. Even the, you know, things like lockdowns as a public health measure affect different groups differentially. It's just the way it is. So I think that's, I think we're going to see a lot more students interested in thinking about health and healthcare in a holistic way coming out of this. They've been ahead of my, you know, my colleagues in my generation anyway, but I think that's going to get accelerated. You know, even things like income supports, sick days, you know, it's very hard to manage a lot of these lockdown situations if you don't have, you know, some form of intelligent support for the fact that people get sick and they can't come to work. If you create incentives for people to come to work when they're sick, you create spread of the epidemic. And yet, you know, in Ontario, we still don't have proper sick pay instituted. Other provinces do, and I think it's benefited them. But it's also a good social measure. It's just good sense. It's good public health. It's good sense. It's supportive employment, and on. There's a long list of things. In terms of higher education, I think that we're going to have to do a big build back. And I know, again, I've talked to certainly the head of CIHR, Mike Strong, about this, who's former dean of medicine and is, I think, pretty attuned to the damage done to a lot of young people's trajectories who were particularly those who relied on in-person research or lab-based research. So we have to look at extending thesis dates. I think that's happening widely. At least I'm hearing it is, and I hope it's true. You have to extend graduate student fellowships to allow things to get done. I hope there's not going to be a spate of demands for reapplication, that they're simply extended. More generally, I think we are going to need to invest a lot more in, and this was the theme of the 2017 report, we have to invest a lot more in young people. We don't have the suite of supports for graduate students and postdocs that we need, although it did get improved in one of the recent budgets. That was very much due to advocacy by students and postdocs, not by old farts like me. The students said, let's go in and shake things up. They got to high officials in finance and bingo, the money came. So I think students will have to keep advocating for these things and postdocs will have to keep advocating. But I do think that investment, not just in students and trainees, but young faculty is important. The last thing I'd say, the point that was raised by Dawn about the structure of universities is highly disciplinary, which brings a certain rigor, and I respect it. I think the older big universities tend to be more rigid that way, and it creates gridlock in terms of room for students to pursue their interests. I think it's getting better again, but even the way we assess academics, you generally have a track of research, education, and creative professional activity. But of the two, the easiest tracks are research and education. Those are the two ones that are traditionally seen to be the fast tracks. Creative professional activity is where a lot of work that could be done that is invaluable in building community, building Indigenous knowledge, building connections, and making a difference, knowledge translation. That's under that rubric, but it's hard to advance through the ranks on that one. So again, we have work to do inside these institutions, not to in any way, abandon scholarship and science of a more traditional nature, but rather to find ways to integrate and lift up these different paradigms. Finally, it says, I used to say to graduate students sometimes, would worry about what they didn't know. I would say to them, everybody differs in the little bits they know, but in our infinite ignorance, we're equal. I think recognizing that as a universal part of human existence and our shared condition would lead people probably to embrace a lot more of the knowledge they can't get their heads around quickly, and to think more about Indigenous knowledge and every other place we can get information to make things better.
Yeah, I think I just respond to that. Like yes, we get nailed. As Indigenous women in particular, we do get nailed. We never publish enough. We never have enough to advance because we're sitting on 1,000 committees or doing community work. So it's not valued, right? Like Liliana said, or Nidhi, like if you're doing workshops at Six Nations, you're losing points from the university's evaluation of your worth. And so we have to make that decision. Okay, I'm going to sacrifice my career to help the community. Community doesn't know you're doing that. They think, that this is the way that's supported by university. And you're like, no, you're going against logic as an academic. But on the other flip side of that, I think, the community, as Hannah said, when they had to hand over power to them, they collected more interviews. They collected more water. They did more interviews in 2 months during COVID, the birthing center, the midwives, than a graduate student would have been able to pull off in a year and a half. So, the question is, why are they not getting accredited for that labor, that co-creation, that, like Nidhi pointed out to? And I don't know if there's places in the world, Nidhi, that acknowledge and accredit Indigenous contributions to research, because the people who walk away with everything are the academics. From the community's point of view, they're getting the papers published, the conferencing, and there's tension there. So how do we really create and advance and give scholarships to Indigenous knowledge, the people who are learning the language, learning the ceremonies, learning, you know, all the things that they need to know to hold Indigenous knowledge? They're not getting scholarships. They're forced onto unemployment or welfare in order to be free to help the elders and to learn from them. That's the inequity in knowledge. Like, how do we advance? And maybe, I don't know, Nidhi, if there's models, I think you did mention a few that the UN is a little bit more aware of than maybe Canada.
I think these are the exact gaps we have to plug. And this could be a long journey of getting them accredited and acknowledged in existing mainstream academic systems. And I think in somewhere, some institutions or some states are progressing well. I can talk about some research institutions from India. If you're doing a PhD with them and you go and work with community, you can offset some of your university learning time, like taking formal courses. So there are offset mechanisms that has to be endorsed by a certain institution. And I think that is a challenge. I mean, there is no blueprint that can be applied, but it has to be very contextual and case-based. But it's high time that we do that. We break the hegemony of singular knowledge and learning systems to diversify how we imbibe information and knowledge, and how we evaluate this learning that we get through different systems. And I think I take the case of myself. I mean, I did a working PhD where I was working with communities, and I was convincing my director of Indian Space Research Organization that I need to be evaluated based on what I'm doing on the ground, not just taking courses. And I couldn't take any courses, but the learning that I got working with the community I could have never learned from the books. But I think it's a balance that we have to create. And I think if we get this balance acknowledged and integrated in academia and research centers, I think we have done a good job. And I think that can create generation, a new generation to be champions of integrative learning. And this is transformed from being theoretical framings to an action-oriented paradigms. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. Yep.
I'm going to have to run.
Yep.
I'm turning into a pumpkin. So can I just thank you again, as always, educational for an old academic bureaucrat, new insights and new motivation to get back to some of the stuff we did a couple of years ago and follow up. So thank you.
Get back to us and let us know. Thank you for coming out.
My pleasure. Lovely to meet you, Mikasa.
So much.
And Nidhi, great pleasure. Thank you for your time.
Ona.
Part of it.
No problem.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you again.
Nidhi's hanging in there with us. I know Hannah's got another really good question about gender and science. And I don't know, Hannah, I know we got to skip about 10, but.
No, that's okay. So, I mean, it was in relation to David's report, but I think it's important in the work that you do as well, Nidhi. And I mean, the four of us left here in this conversation are all women of color, so it's important. There's a gap. There's definitely a gap that goes without saying. But where do you see the power in having women-led teams? As just for background, once again, our global water futures, all three of our teams are predominantly led by women of color, Dawn being one of them. And I not to toot our own horn, but we're doing a good job, and it's different dynamic than anything the rest of us have ever been a part of, and it makes a difference. You can feel it, but that also means more challenges at the same time. So I just kind of wanted your take on your experience, as well as just where do you see that power and that empowerment taking us? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Yeah. Sorry about that. So thanks for pointing out that we do have these good examples where 3 programs are led by women. And it's not just about representation or making the gender parity. It's about bringing the diverse perspectives in science, in research, and in acknowledgement of different values and knowledge that each gender group brings on board. And this is not just long due, but it's also very critical if we have to attain a sustainable future for us, not just in the domain of water or in energy or food, but a sustaining planet, a healthy planet, a well-balanced lives and livelihoods, and acknowledgement of diversity. And there is a placeholder in Sustainable Development Goal portfolio on SDG 6, and that says it all. So the gender dimension is something that has driven the Millennium Development Goals. And in the next 10 years we are left on SDG, we need to show not just more numbers, but the perspectives and the change paradigms.
Right.
No, we really appreciate all the work you do. And Hannah and I know Catherine and Makasha, they face a very unique, because they're not only doing a paradigm shift, which is kind of bad enough in an environment such as a university, but they're women of color. So having support such as yourself, or, you know, David was actually very supportive of Indigenous knowledge when we presented, and Liliana, of course, is just amazing and the work she does. But, you know, that's not really who we engage with on a daily basis. Those are thought leaders, if you will. You're all at the top of the game in that role. But I think giving encouraging words to our young academics here is always important, because it can just wear you down after a while, especially if you're in a pandemic. And I see them kind of start out strong, and then it's like they go through the meat grinder, and they're starting to wonder, like, is this, you know, is this normal? And I want to tell them it's not. It's the new way forward. I don't know if you have any parting words of encouragement for our young generation of decolonized scientists.
I think the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration has been tagged as hashtag Generation Restoration, and it outlines 10 key points. Empower global movement. We talked about it. Financing restoration on the ground, led by youth. Very key point. Setting the right incentives. If youth is taking the initiative to bring those change paradigms, or to lead those change paradigms, this effort has to be properly and duly acknowledged in their curriculum, in their academic institutions, and whatever agencies they represent. To celebrate leadership, and specifically youth leadership, to shift behaviors so that the youth is acknowledged properly. To invest in research, we talked about it, David and Lilian gave equal emphasis on understanding, but building up capacity, to celebrating the culture of restoration led by youth, and to build up the next generation, listen, learn, and exchange. And this hashtag Generation Restoration is, I think, explicitly pointing out to the role of youth in leading those change paradigms. So you are in the front, you're the front runners, and we will derive motivation looking at you. So I think since you're the champions, you can't feel disheartened. You have to keep going. You have to self-motivate, and you have to ensure that this is about your future, and you have a role to play, because without you, we can't define your future. Let's close it at that.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you so much for those words.
I was going to say you're a great example of someone who took a different route. You didn't, it doesn't sound, took the traditional route. You had some hardships. And back then, or however long ago that was, I mean, things aren't all the way better yet. So we're still facing those challenges. I can't imagine what you had to face to get to where you are. And I look up to you. I think we all do. And especially the UNU is doing some wonderful work with experiential learning, and kind of the experiences that I think students like Kasha, myself, and Catherine would like to have, where we're immersed in the communities and we're doing work outside of attending lectures and writing just our thesis. I mean, I think it was cut off at the beginning, but this episode and next is actually meant to be an appendix for my thesis. We're hoping to integrate, mediums and ways to disseminate that are different, but they're not new. We're not reinventing the wheel. Everything you just said about listening to the youth, from the time I've been around community, those are just genuinely Indigenous worldviews. They're not new. I don't think that they should be introduced. They're being reintegrated. And I learn so much every day, but it's just amazing. It blows everyone's mind, some of these new concepts when really they've been around forever. And I know that's how Kasha and Dawn carried themselves. So Kasha being the host of the show has been amazing to watch. It's been inspirational. But it's also, it shouldn't be something so new. It should be a commonplace. And I'm really proud of us having this all female team. I mean, that was a little part of it, but it makes a difference. It's a different dynamic. We have other wonderful team members as well. I just, this type of work makes you want to get up in the morning. I know Dawn was saying that with COVID, it's been hard. I myself actually had COVID. My family did as well. That was hard to get out of. We're still getting out of it. But I don't think that I would have been able to return to school if it wasn't something of this caliber, of something where we're creating and we're doing something new every day. And you know what, grad school does count as having these conversations and having these as interviews, or just something other than being in the lab and doing what we're told is grad school. So I really appreciate your work. Thank you so much, Nidhi.
Pleasure. You're taking small steps to big transformative change. You not realize it today. Look back after 10 years and you'll know what you have done to make that change.
Thank you.
Exactly. Yeah. They're doing amazing work, and I try to keep them reminded of that, you know, regardless of what the university or other people understand. When you're making a new path, it's hard, and you just have to kind of buckle up and warrior up, and that's why I call it warrior science. Okay, did you have any parting words?
No, I just totally agree, and like it means a lot coming from you, and knowing my background is like completely different to any Canadian regular Canadian life. And so like it's really I guess encouraging to know that, like, I mean, it's gonna be a tough road, but it's going, like, we're gonna make big changes, and it needs to happen, not just for myself, but for other Indigenous women and men like me who have the same story and who are facing the same exact struggle, because I'm just one community member out of like 25,000 youth, and that's why it's needed, and that's why we're doing the work that we're doing. So yes, thank you for all of your work that you're doing, and I know that you probably changed so many people's lives, and working the way that needs to be done, I think. And like, I know that you do experiential learning at the United Nations
University. Yeah.
University, and know that's great work, and all of the work that you're doing, and working with my mom, and still keeping calm with all the madness and late deadlines and such. So yeah, thank you for
Par for the course, right, Nidhi?
Thank you for taking the lead in bringing this voice to the world. I think many people are listening to us or will see us through your initiative, and that will change their lives. So well done, Makasha. Please keep carrying the flag.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Your first time, and we had, without you as our technician, we just fell apart.
Sorry.
No, it's not sorry. It's we couldn't do your job. But we tried, and thank God Catherine is there to back us up. So thank you, Catherine. And I think next week we'll have figured out the new system that we'll need to do this. So good job. Hopefully next week is just as enlightening.
Yep.
So, good night, everyone, and thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Good
Take care.
night.
Good night.
Thank you, everybody, for staying tuned in our second episode of our season finale. That was just our first episode, our first part, and our second part will be next week. So we will continue on these types of conversation into next week, and we'll have all new panelists. So we are super happy that you stayed with us throughout the 2 hours basically again. And
We
we
told
are-
them it would be an hour. We promised it would be 1 hour. I just can't do it.
yeah, we promised them it would be 1 hour, and sometimes it just does not work out that way. But yeah, next week we'll have Dr. John Small, who is a Canada Research Chair in Environmental Change, and Dr. Charles Delanoy, who is an Assistant Professor of Chemical Engineering at McMaster University. And also don't forget to follow us on our social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and check out our brand new website in order to stay updated on our show and our project.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that we will, and I thank Hannah for having being our guest co-host tonight, and I hope that you had fun.
Thank you.
And yeah. Yeah, and our second,
She dragged me in here. She's like, okay, I'm totally off kilter. I need you in here now. I was like,
yeah,
okay.
things were not going as to script, so we needed to bring in the big boss to really sum it up and make sure that everybody's heard. in
It's
the
all
correct way.
good. It all goes the way it's meant to go. You did a
Yeah.
good job.
This was all spirit's work.
It happens for a reason.
Everything happens for a reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you, and we'll be closing with the outro video with the bird singers.
And
If,
Yeah.
if Catherine was able to download it,
Yeah.
were you?
if not, we just might end like this one was a ride.
Yeah, I think maybe we'll just end there.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next week. Stay tuned. Ona.
Bye.
Woo!